Petition Hayward Post Office.
Order. We come now to the adjournment. The whip to move. Come.
I'd like to move this House to now adjourn.
Indeed. The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mr. Roger Godsiff.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity of raising the important issue of parental involvement in primary school pupils learning about the Equality Act, which was passed in 2010. The Equality Act 2010, which I welcomed, supported and voted for, has 9 protected characteristics. These are age, disability, gender assignment, marriage and civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, sexual orientation. Accompanying the words of the Act are guidance, and the Sex and Relationship Education Guidance 2000 is also important. It's referred to and is relevant, in particular 113, which states, in early primary school years, education about relationships needs to focus on friendships, bullying and the building of self-esteem. 131 further states, sexual orientation and what is taught in schools is an area of concern for some parents. Schools that liaise closely with parents should be able to reassure parents of the programme and the context in which it will be presented. Mr. Speaker, the Children and Social Work Act 2017, which again I supported and voted for, put relationships and sex education on a statutory footing and requires all primary schools to teach age-appropriate relationship education. This, however...
I thank him for giving way and thank him for bringing this to the House for consideration. I recently read a post which said it's not about homosexuality, heterosexuality or transsexuality. Stop promoting sexuality to our children, full stop. Let kids be kids. We need to protect the innocence of our children at all costs, and I believe this is only the parents' right but their duty and their job. And would the member not agree that to prevent this and enforce teaching against the will of a parent is not acceptable in any way, shape or form?
I will deal with that later. The relationship and sex education does not, however, come in until September 2020, although primary schools can introduce it a year earlier. There was also draft guidance on how the Act should be implemented, and I supported and voted for the statutory instrument associated with this guidance. This legislation builds on the provisions of the Equality Act, and although it has relevance, as I shall explain later, it is the Equality Act and the 9 protected characteristics that I'm talking about today, not least because this is quoted by the head teacher of the school in my constituency where the controversy has arisen. Mr. Speaker, the Equality Act does not require primary schools to actively teach the 9 characteristics. According to the guidance accompanying the Act, schools are free to include a full range of issues, ideas and materials in their syllabus, and to expose pupils to thoughts and ideas of all kinds, however challenging or controversial, without fear of legal challenge based on the protected characteristics. I support and welcome the guidance, but, Mr. Speaker, therein lies a problem. In Birmingham, there are 258 primary schools. 39 are in my constituency. Some are local authority maintained Others are part of academy chains, but that's pretty irrelevant in the context of this debate. In many of the 256, not 258, 256 schools, head teachers are introducing pupils to what is in the Equality Act in ways that they believe meet the requirements of the guidance, recognising that some of the 9 characteristics may pose challenges for some communities who have more conservative social attitudes, and taking into account the demographic composition of their own schools. They've chosen to engage with their parents to explain the 9 characteristics, have workshops about the individual characteristics, have ongoing consultations with parents, showing them the type of materials that the school propose using, and engaging with parents about what age was most appropriate for the various characteristics to be introduced to pupils. Now, Mr. Speaker, this seems eminently sensible to me. It also seems to be in line with references in the Children and Social Work Act and the draft guidance, which refers to age appropriateness in the context of religious background and the need for ongoing consultations. I unreservedly support and applaud those 256 head teachers, and obviously their parents are overwhelmingly supportive because there has been no appreciable backlash by parents at those schools. At 2 schools in Birmingham, however, there has been a major reaction amongst parents, which has become increasingly bitter and polarised. One of the schools is in my constituency, and the other is in an adjoining constituency represented by the Honourable Member for Birmingham Ladywood.
Stephen Daphne.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. What does he think has caused this particular crisis right at this moment, given what he said about other schools where this hasn't been an issue? I would put it to him that it's perhaps due to at least 2 individuals I'm aware of who have been particularly whipping this up. And creating a myth and creating fear. I can say that I've never had these issues raised by any schools or any of my constituents. I have as diverse a constituency as he does. And yet the 2 same individuals who've been involved in the Birmingham process have recently arrived in Cardiff, and I suddenly started receiving emails actually referring to the English education system rather than the Welsh. Does he think there's any coincidence there in terms of why this has become an issue now and yet not for so many else in the rest of the country that is equally diverse?
Godsiff.
I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention. I cannot give him an answer to that because I can only refer to what is happening in Birmingham, and I shall continue to refer to that. Mr. Speaker, in the Westminster Hall debate on the 25th of February, the Honourable Member for Ladywood referred to the fact that parents were complaining that there had been no consultation whatever about how the 9 protected characteristics were being imparted to children, and that children, some as young as 4 or 5, were telling parents about what they allegedly had been taught in lessons. This had caused parents considerable concern. At the school in my constituency, a similar situation occurred. There was no consultation with the parents, and the head teacher made it plain that no consultation was going to take place, and no collective meetings with parents were held. The head teacher said that she or her deputy would meet individual parents on a one-to-one basis to listen to their concerns. But when such meetings took place, the same answer was always given, namely that the school was only carrying out the Equality Act. Well, I have given way on a couple of occasions already, the honourable member will have plenty of time to make her speech later, because this could go on till 7 o'clock.
Yes, so you've got plenty.
Mr. Speaker, understandably, some parents were unhappy with this response and felt the school had no regard for their concerns. They therefore had their own meeting. Mr. Speaker, I've made clear I'm not giving way. They therefore had their own meeting, and after asking the brother of one of the parents, who is in the property business and is well educated and articulate, to be the coordinator, they began their protest, which I will touch on in a minute. Mr. Speaker, the common theme which links these two schools together is that parents at both schools were not consulted nor involved in how the 9 protected characteristics were to be imparted to children. Parents were excluded entirely from the process, although the Equality Act is not an exam subject, for example, like English or mathematics. Mr. Speaker, all schools call regular meetings of parents when they want to inform them about important issues. It is part and parcel of school life that regular meetings take place with parents, but no meetings were held at the two schools with parents.
Will you give way?
I won't. Mr. Speaker, the question that those who sought to characterise the disputes at both schools as a clash of cultures should be asking is what had the head teachers and their staffs at 256 primary schools got right, with the support of their parents, while in 2 schools it seems to have gone very wrong.
Not had people whipping it up.
I will now turn briefly to the protests outside the school in my constituency.
Will the honourable member give way?
No, well, the school is in an area with a very large Muslim population. Nearly all the children who attend school are from Muslim families. When the protest started outside the school in my constituency, I didn't take sides or make public comment. I took the view that parents of young children do not just protest against their child's school unless they have some grievance.
Whipped up for it.
Parents will protest against many things. The government, against the local council, but to protest against your own child's school is rare, and there has to be some particular reason for it.
Fair.
I went, Mr. Speaker, and saw the head teacher, and I asked questions and I put suggestions to her. I have not deliberately put her responses in the public domain because I believe that if I had, it would have inflamed the situation. But I did tell the leader of the council what her responses were, and 3 DFE officials were present and took detailed notes, which were presumably conveyed to the Minister. Mr. Speaker, I've known the head teacher at this school for a number of years, and I respect her academic achievements at the school, which follows on from the excellent work the previous head, Anne Bufton, initiated at the school. Before leaving the meeting with the head teacher, I did say that if she or her staff felt threatened by the protests outside the school, then she should apply for a restraint injunction to get them moved elsewhere. And I explained to her the procedure for doing that. No such injunction was sought until over a month later. I then invited, through my Muslim assistant, the leaders of the protests to come and see me at my house. I was shown copies of letters written to the head teacher expressing their concerns, which were not replied to. I saw statements from parents saying that head teacher would not have a parents' meeting, but would only talk to parents on a one-to-one basis. I saw statements saying that when such meetings took place, the individual parents were told that what the school was doing was the Equality Act. I saw letters and statements which time and again emphasised that the protesters, mostly young mothers, were not seeking to undermine the Equality Act, not least because the Equality Act protects Muslims from Islamophobia criticism, and that all they were asking for was meaningful consultation. I will in a minute. Was meaningful consultation about what was appropriate for the 9 protected characteristics to be introduced to their children. They told me they had ongoing contact with the appropriate police superintendent every day a protest was organised. They told him when the protest would start, when it would finish, and they always asked for the police to be present to ensure that no laws were broken by the demonstrators.
Well, would the member give way on that point? Would the member give way on that point?
On that point, yes.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much for giving way. I spent a couple of hours with the head teachers of these schools. And would you agree that whilst you're talking about the demonstrations, that the reason probably why the head teacher didn't have a public meeting was because in those public arenas, she has been called a paedophile and worse. Would the member agree?
Well, stick up for her.
Mr. Speaker,
push her under the bus.
There are primary schools throughout Birmingham, as I said, 256, where meetings take place all the time between parents and teachers. I don't accept the argument that there couldn't be parents' meetings at the other 2 schools in Birmingham. If the head teacher or any other teachers felt that such a meeting could develop into an unpleasant atmosphere, then all they had to do was to ask for the police to be present, and they would gladly have been present, or else they could have asked for local councillors and the MP to be present. But no such things happened. I've given her a lot. In a moment, I will. Going back to the protest, after each demonstration, they had email correspondence with the police superintendent to seek written confirmation that the police were satisfied with the way the protest had been conducted. And they asked each time whether any arrests had taken place or any cautions been issued. I've seen copies of the email correspondence and confirmation by the police superintendent, who I've known and dealt with for many years, that no arrests were made or cautions given. I make the point again. During the time the demonstrations have taken place, no arrests have been made because, according to the police, no laws have been broken. I was finally, when I met with protesters at my house, shown the petition signed by 229 parents expressing no confidence in the head teacher. I subsequently spoke to the police superintendent, who I'd spoken to regularly throughout the protests. Mr. Speaker, after listening to the different accounts from the head teacher, the parents who were protesting, and the police, I came to the conclusion that the parents who were protesting had some valid reasons for doing so.
Oh, dear.
As the head teacher seemed totally unwilling to have meetings with the parents to address their concerns and to seek a compromised way of resolving the conflict. I have given away on many occasions up to now.
3 times.
I told the protesters this, and I also told them that they have made their point and that the protest should end. I reiterated this when they came to see me at my surgery, which was filmed on phone camera and then put into the public domain in an abridged version.
Bullying a councillor.
Mr.
Order, the honourable gentleman resumes. I absolutely understand the very strong feelings that exist on this subject, but can I just say to colleagues that there is no way, and I say this as much for public interest as for any other reason, that this debate will be curtailed. It can run until 7 o'clock, so any honourable or right honourable member who wishes to catch my eye has an extremely good chance of doing so. But the honourable gentleman has the floor, and whatever members think about his decision to give way or not, he has the floor and he has a right to be heard, and he will be heard. Mr. Roger Godsiff.
I'm obliged to you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the breakdown in trust between the head teacher and the parents has not been helped by certain tweets that the head teacher has put out. She is, of course, perfectly entitled to tweet what she wants to, as is everybody else. But to call parents who are participating in highly organised, police-supervised protests a, quote, mob, which needs to be, quote, sorted, and accuses Muslim parents, mostly young women, of, quote, homophobic hatred, and to say that, quote, if we allow parents to think consult means demanding resignations if we don't get our way. I don't actually think that that is helpful in reducing tension, because it's immediately recycled on multiple social media sites, which builds up a frenzy of hatred against parents. As I've said, mostly young mothers who have done nothing wrong, Mr. Speaker, nothing wrong other than be good mothers who want to express concerns about what their children are telling them. Mr.
Go on, your local colleagues.
My honourable friend has referenced concerns on numerous occasions, but he has actually not been able to articulate what are those concerns. And having seen the literature, I'm not quite sure what he and the parents are actually referencing.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have children attending schools in Birmingham. They are grown up. I have a grandchild who is not in Birmingham. It is not for me to pass judgment on what the concerns of parents are. If parents say they have concerns and they have sought to raise those concerns with the head teacher and they have not been allowed to raise those concerns, I believe, I won't give it away anymore, I believe that it's incumbent on a Member of Parliament to articulate those concerns. That doesn't mean to pass judgment on them, but if they have concerns, then they are entitled to have them addressed and to look at. And so far as the concerns of parents at those two schools were concerned,
What are they? Tell us.
there was no engagement, no meetings, whereas at 256 other schools in Birmingham, they were doing things differently. Now, Mr. Speaker, What is this homophobic hatred that these parents are supposed to be spreading? Because that's massively serious, massively serious. Well, let's have a look at some of the police witness statements. As I said, the police were at every protest. These are not hearsay or recycled versions which have been fed to social media to feed the frenzy. They are legal daily reports by police officers who were present. They say over and over again, quote, the chants were repeated over and over again. What were those chants? Our children, our choice. Listen to parents. Let kids be kids. We are not homophobic. Parent governors step down. Head teacher step down. Not nice for the head teacher or parent governor, but I don't accept that as being homophobic.
Will my honourable friend give way? Just on point of information.
No, I've given way on a lot of things. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, the police present wore body camera footage and were asked by the organisers of the protest to check whether any placards contravened the law. I understand only one placard was deemed inappropriate at an early protest, and the people carrying the banners were told not to bring them again. Now, Mr. Speaker, I make these points because I believe that the parents have not had a fair chance to put their side of the dispute. They've been branded as professional agitators, accused of not having children at the school by a counsellor, called, in quotes, a mob, close quotes, and told that they were spewing out homophobic hatred.
Well, you can join them.
Mr. Speaker, these mothers have been speared. And the fact, Mr. Speaker, that the local Member of Parliament, having weighed up the evidence, listened to all sides of the argument, came down to the conclusion that the people who were protesting had just reasons to complain and to protest, merely added an additional target for the witch hunters and increased the lust for a sacrifice irrespective of the facts. Mr. Speaker, I now return to a couple of specific questions that I would ask the Minister, and I have actually supplied the Minister with the questions before so he could have an opportunity of looking at them. The reason why I ask these questions is I suspect that there are many primary school head teachers watching this debate who, like their colleagues in Birmingham, want to know if, inadvertently, they are contravening the law in the way they impart the 9 protected characteristics of the Equality Act to their pupils. As I have said, 256 out of 258 primary schools in Birmingham are, in different ways, ensuring that their pupils know, when they transfer to secondary school, that any form of discrimination, victimisation, prejudice or bullying of other people who fall within the 9 protected characteristics is unlawful. They do this by engaging with their parents to explain the 9 characteristics, having workshops about the individual characteristics, having ongoing consultations with the parents, showing them the type of material they propose to use, and engaging with parents about what age was most appropriate for the various characteristics. I will actually come to that in a minute. They want, Mr. Speaker, to have clarification. Firstly, they want to know whether it's permissible for head teachers to partner with parents in deciding how the 9 protected characteristics are imparted to pupils, bearing in mind that parents cannot have any veto over which characteristics are taught. And secondly, they would like to know, do the 9 protected characteristics have to be taught all together, or can they be spread out and imparted to pupils during their time in primary school, taking into account at what, quote, age-appropriate age the head and or parents consider it most age-appropriate for each protected characteristic to be imparted to the children. Mr. Speaker, I ask these questions because many primary heads are looking at what has happened at the 2 schools where controversy has arisen, and they do not want to be accused of discrimination, which of course is illegal, in the way they are dealing with the Equality Act and the 9 protected characteristics. So I would be grateful for the Minister for clarity, because it will affect the relationship education provision which comes in 2020 and which can be introduced in September 2019, and which is much more specific about, quote, consultation and, quote, age appropriateness. Mr. Speaker, I've no opinion myself at what ages primary school children should be introduced to the provisions of the 9 protected characteristics. For example, I recently attended a meeting held by the Head Teachers Union here in the Commons in Committee Room 9, at which a head teacher, I think it was a head teacher, he may have been a deputy head from Manchester, argued, very forcibly, that the whole age-appropriate concept should be scrapped completely, and that children aged 2 should be introduced to the provisions of the protected characteristics. Now, Mr. Speaker, if parents of the children involved are happy with this, then who am I to say it should not happen? But, Mr. Speaker, parents who in international law have the prime responsibility for the upbringing of their children have, in my opinion, to be partners with schools in making these decisions. Likewise, I have no prescribed views about what teaching materials should be used. I believe that schools and parents should make this decision after proper consultation, which is what is happening in most schools at the moment. And with regards to the question asked by my colleague in sedentary position, yeah, I have. I've read most of those books now that have been given to me by my friend, and some of them are very good. The Little Mermaid is a particularly good one, and I've just got a copy for my grandchild. But there are some of the other books which I think my Muslim constituents would like to talk through with the school and to understand what the concepts are. But they can't talk it through with the school if the school won't have consultation. Mr. Speaker, I regret the controversies which have arisen around the 2 schools in Birmingham. I believe they could have been avoided if the schools had taught the provisions of the Equality Act in different ways and taken the parents' concerns into account. For my part, Mr. Speaker, I apologise unreservedly for any offence caused to any person of whatever sexual orientation by anything I've said or written. In particular, I apologise unreservedly to members of the LGBT community in Birmingham and throughout the country for anything I may have said or written which has caused offence to them. Mr. Speaker, I can assure you it most certainly was not intended.
Thank you. Jack Dormey.
Mr. Speaker, I had not intended to speak, but in light of what I've heard today, I decided so to do. Can I start by saying this? I come from an Irish Catholic background. I know from my own experience what cultural conservatism can be like. I know some of the terrible things that happened in the Irish culture, Catholic culture, going back over many years. At its most obscene, the Magdalene sisters. But ultimately that changed because brave Catholics challenged their own culture and it changed. And now Ireland is a tolerant country with a gay Prime Minister. It would have been thought unachievable and impossible in decades that have gone by. Now, in relation to what's been happening in Birmingham, I'm the first to respect cultures, including cultural conservatism, and that there should be engagement without hesitation. I do not accept that what's been said, that there's been no engagement by the head, Sarah Hewitt-Clarkson, with parents. I think there has been engagement, but if I can distinguish between two things, on the one hand there are those that feel uneasy, but on the other hand there are those that have been deliberately stirring this up. And it's not just now in Birmingham. Honourable friend referred to what's happening in Cardiff, but in a number of cities around the country we're seeing a network develop, which, to be frank, is absolutely wrong, because if we go down the path, as a very good Muslim friend and a constituent of mine said, Jack, if we go down the path of dividing and demonising, or in any way suggesting that we would ever do that, then our country and our city is a poorer country. So I never want to see the day when we ever feed in any way the view that there's something wrong about two men who are living together, or two women living together. I remember in the old Transport and General Workers Union many years ago, a man who just came out to me and it was desperate. He was in tears. He was afraid to speak out. Yeah. But now in Birmingham, we're the city of pride. Yes. Pride with a small p and pride with a big P. Yeah. We had tens of thousands marching in Birmingham, celebrating our diversity, and our rich cultural diversity, our rich ethnic diversity, and our diversity in terms of sexual preference. Yeah. Long may it always be the case. And the final point I'd make, I stress again, I distinguish between absolutely that one has to engage, listen, explain. I understand that. But if there are forces on the march, the kind of which we thought were history in our country, then we have to say, no, you're wrong.
Yes.
Well, I hope it's reassuring to colleagues to know that you'll all get in. Don't worry. Angela Eagle.
Speaker, teaching about LGBT existence and relationships and showing respect and legitimacy to all, regardless of their sexual orientation, is something that has not been a feature of our school system for very long. That is because of the odious and appalling effects of Section 28, which was passed in the 1980s, in a circumstance which was very similar to some of the scare stories that we are hearing about the possible dire effects of simply teaching sex and relationship education in schools, something, Mr. Speaker, in my opinion, that we should have been doing in this country generations ago. And if we had have done it generations ago, there would have been an awful lot of much happier and well-adjusted people than those that have been monstered in the way that they have, for the way that they are, in a system that was disfigured by the effects of Section 28. So here we are, many years later, finally making progress on LGBT rights in law and reaching fantastic levels of formal equality in our law, finally. One of the most important social reforms, I think, that the last Labour government was responsible for, and one which, to their credit, has been continued by administrations subsequently. And I know of the Minister's own personal commitment to this agenda. And yet, here we are in the middle of a similar kind of moral scare, which is being whipped up by people who have a different agenda to the well-being of children and their adjustment to the facts and experience of 21st century life in the UK. And we've seen it as exposed on the television in some of the closed Facebook groups of the individuals that are involved, making claims about the sexual orientation of the teachers that are involved in this school, using language that I wouldn't use in this chamber. We've seen it in the mob reactions outside, and I don't think that it's appropriate, however we do these things, that young primary school pupils should have to run a gauntlet of screaming demonstrators simply to get to school. Noisy, vociferous, aggressive kind of shouting and chanting. That's going to be traumatic for any kind of young primary school pupil, and we shouldn't be subjecting them to it. And to be honest, no parents who believe that they're acting in the best interests of their children should be making those children run such a gauntlet. And we know, although I exempt my honourable friend from this, although I wish he'd have let me ask him a question, we know that the motivations of some of those involved in this are reactionary, and they are to return us to an era where LGBT people should get back in the closet and hide and be ashamed of the way they are. We aren't going to get back in the closet or hide or be ashamed of the way we are. And nor are we going to allow a generation of pupils that are now in school to go through what the pupils in the 80s had to go through because this chamber let them down. Yes. And nor are we going to allow this to happen in the name of religion. So I'm a humanist. I'm married to a Catholic. And she does much work with LGBT religious organisations to try to put together coalitions across religions of moderate, decent, sensible, religious people who recognise the right of LGBT people to exist, to have access to respect and dignity, and to have their rights in law. And we mustn't put together this view that if somebody has a religious objection, that somehow there can be no debate about it from then on in. There are multiple views in religions about the legitimacy of LGBT rights, and it's only on the far extremist, fundamentalist fringes that we get the kind of hostility that is being shown on some of the Facebook groups of these campaigners. And I'd like to know a lot more about the network that is behind causing this, because it's a deliberate reactionary attempt to take back progressive advance and decency for children. I'm happy to give way.
I thank her for giving way. She is speaking incredibly movingly. As somebody who lives closer, I think, than anybody else to the schools, particularly in question, and lives in the community amongst the people who go to this school. I want it to be said on the record that she is absolutely right in what she says about this being on the fringes, because the Muslim community that I live amongst, I do not recognise from that mob.
I thank the honourable lady, and she has a great deal of experience in this, not least because she lives in amongst the community that is being portrayed in this way. Now, we must, Mr. Speaker, not give in to this kind of organised campaign that is effectively being organised from the outside. The Equality Act, which was passed in 2010, so it's been on the statute book for 9 years now, actually says that schools have a duty not to discriminate against LGBT people, which includes discrimination against pupils who are LGBT, which, to be fair, wouldn't probably be very apparent at primary school level, but who are perceived to be LGBT, and pupils with LGBT parents, carers and family members. These are the diverse parents that we have in our communities now, and the children that they send to school, or the potentially LGBT children in school, do not deserve to be treated with anything other than equality and respect. And all of the teaching on relationship and sexual education, all that means is that this diversity needs to be represented. It's not propagandising, it's not trying to turn people gay, which I've heard about. I'm not sure it's possible to turn people gay. But there certainly would be no gay people if you had to be taught about being gay. But their respect, their rights to have an equal welcome in school, not to be bullied, not to be treated as if they're lesser, not to be made to feel that somehow there's something wrong with them, not to feel suicidal, not to be called faggot or leser in school, not to be humiliated. All of this is what we're talking about when it comes to relationship and sex education. Plain, simple decency.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour and privilege to follow my right honourable friend for Wallasey, a very personal and very passionate speech, which I wholeheartedly agree. And I was sorry that we had to come here today to even have to take part in this debate. And I've listened carefully to what the honourable gentleman for Birmingham Hall Green has said. I listened to his apology. I have to say that I'm always welcome to listen to an apology, but much of what he said in his speech contradicted that, and indeed contradicted what he had actually said on that recording, which I have viewed. I'm glad he's read the books now, at least some of them. I'm glad that my office has been able to help with that. I find it unfortunate that he made comments and waded into this debate without having looked at them, given that they're at the very heart of this issue. I have looked at the books myself, Mr. Speaker. I've looked at these materials that cause so much alleged offence. But there's nothing in them that I think would cause offence, and in fact they, along with many other inclusive education teaching materials and books, teach about all the range of difference that we have in our lives, and they certainly don't get into the details of sex or anything biological. We're talking about things that are age appropriate, that are being directed at younger children. It's about understanding the world around them, that there may be children in their class who indeed are Muslim or Jewish or black or white or a woman or a man or gay or lesbian or trans. This is the world we live in. This is the reality we live in. This is the country we live in. And I live in just as diverse a community as the honourable member for Hall Green. I'm pleased to say that at the weekend I went to the Grangetown Festival in my own community and was able to visit the Pride Cymru stall right in the heart of one of my largest Muslim communities. And there, mixing in that community, were the LGBT community, different churches, different mosques, different Hindu temples, different community organisations, and they were all just getting on with their lives and making a difference to their community and supporting young people and running activities and running diversionary activities for those who might be caught up in a knife crime or other difficulties in the community, and supporting each other and working together as a community. They weren't interested in dividing each other on the nature of their sexuality or their sex or their race or their religion. They were all working and living together. So there is a different way. There is a different way we can live. And I have watched with horror as I've seen the scenes in Birmingham. And as I said, I watch with horror because, as I said, I believe that they have been whipped up into a sense of a true moral panic about some problem that doesn't actually exist. It's become extremely unpleasant, extremely divisive, as we have seen, and that is spreading, as has been said, to other parts of the UK. And I want to draw the Honourable Gentleman's attention, indeed the attention of the House, to some of those who have been involved in instigating some of the language and the protests and some of the division that we've seen, because at least two of them, as I said, have come down to Cardiff recently, one of whom, thankfully, was spotted and the talk was cancelled, but a woman called Dr. Godfrey Fawcett, who, in fact, is being investigated by the British Psychological Society at the moment for her comments. She, last year in a YouTube clip, said that there was a totalitarian endeavour to indoctrinate our children in sexual ideologies. She runs the so-called Stop RSE campaign and has talked about a war on morality. Another group called so-called Islamic RSE, run by a gentleman called Ustad Torofdar. I have seen for myself, Mr. Speaker, the handy guide that can be handed to parents about how they should effectively infiltrate governors' bodies, PTAs, and try and influence activities in their school with a whole set of things that are allegedly going on in their schools. There's no evidence, of course, presented, and suggesting that parents might want to get involved and raise these concerns. And, of course, it gives form letters to be sent to MPs, to the media, to schools, with all sorts of wild and fanciful allegations about, trying to somehow corrupt young people. And I'm not going to read out the letter, I've got it, but some parts of it I just find so offensive. As I said, I've never received a letter of this nature ever in my constituency. I've been an MP for 6.5 years, of extremely diverse constituency, an openly gay MP. I have never seen any of these things until the last few months. And they are originating from these groups, and they're collaborating, and they often involve, as has been said by my honourable friends from Birmingham, individuals who are not even having children at these schools. So this is the very nature of a moral panic. It's a very example of one. So I think we need to look at what is really going on here, rather than any actual perceived problem or issue. Now, my honourable friend has spoken about the legacy of Section 28, and I grew up in a school in South Wales. I certainly wasn't out about my sexuality at the time, and like many other LGBT people, you struggle with these issues your whole life, and it can affect when you come out and how you come out and to whom you come out and all sorts of other things in your life. And I don't want young people living today to go through these experiences. It's just simply horrific. But I know that things can change. I went back last year to a pride parade in the town where I went to school. That would simply been unthinkable 25 years ago when I was at school, when I saw lesbian friends of mine being called dirty lezers and everything else, and all sorts of homophobic abuse going on. But that relates to a time and a place and a set of attitudes and a set of laws which I thought we had got well beyond. And I'm sorry to see chinks in that occurring in different places. And we have to remember this is in a context of a wider set of debates and deeply concerning comments that have been being made, I'm sorry to say, including by some of the candidates for the Conservative leadership, indeed by newly elected MEP Anne Widdecombe, really, really horrific things which should be, quite frankly, from a bygone age. And we have made such progress in this House on so many issues, whether in marriage equality, whether in the way we conduct ourselves in here, and of course, we are the most, I think, LGBT diverse parliament in the world, and that's something we should be celebrating. And I hope very much that is setting an example to young people in our country, that you can be who you are, because God made you too, just like everybody else. Now, Mr Speaker, we have to think about the other side of this. There's been a lot of concerns raised by the Honourable Gentleman for Hall Green about the rights of parents and the rights of certain conservative religious communities. But there's no hierarchy in equality. All those equality characteristics are there alongside one another for a reason, is that we should be promoting all of them, not just one of them, or selectively, or in certain circumstances, or only because it might not offend one group in that constituent group or another. And we have to remember that at the heart of this, Mr Speaker, of course, is the well-being and safeguarding of young people themselves, including young people in the very schools that the Honourable Gentleman is referring to. And I will happily give way.
In 2001, in Holy Cross Church in the Ardoyne district of North Belfast, there was a concentrated campaign, not just against Father Aidan Troy, the priest of that, but from that community. I recently met two girls, 18 years later, who had been primary school pupils at that time, who are still suffering the trauma of that experience. Even if we can put aside for one moment the substantive argument, would my honourable friend not agree with me that it is simply impossible and unconscionable that we can subject primary school children to this sort of concentrated mob abuse? That cannot be allowed, surely.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with what my honourable friend has said, and it just beggars belief that we're potentially creating these situations that are going to affect that cohort of children, not just at those schools, but at plenty of others. And indeed, the reason why there has been such concern about this within the LGBT community more widely is the signals that this sends when they see members of Parliament, when they see a teacher being subjected to such abuse, when they see mobs outside schools, when they see the types of posters that have been displayed. It makes people feel that, perhaps they can't be who they want to be, and that they can't go on living what they want to be, and particularly for younger people, that is a massive issue. And Stonewall, which of course was in this country, largely founded around the issue of Section 28 30 years ago. We'll be celebrating that at Pride this year. I'm very proud that one of the founders of Stonewall lives in my constituency, a very good friend of mine, Lisa Power. I am absolutely deeply concerned when you look at the statistics that they have shared at the moment about mental health, about the issues that young people face. 84% of trans young people have deliberately harmed themselves. In the LGBT community, that's 61%. 2 in 5 LGBT pupils are never taught anything about LGBT issues. Half of LGBT pupils in schools say there isn't an adult they can talk to about issues affecting them. And that whole litany of issues of self-harm, of depression, of taking one's own life in the most extreme circumstances is something that should be of the concern of anybody in this country who cares about the well-being and safety of our young people, instead of focusing on some sort of mythological situation which doesn't exist. We should be focusing on the actual issues that affect young people, because there will be LGBT Muslims and LGBT non-Muslims in those schools. There will be. Because they are in our society. And one of the saddest things, Mr Speaker, is any time I speak on these issues, I get emails, I get phone calls, I get messages particularly from gay Muslim men who tell me about horrific experiences they've had growing up. I don't want to see anybody go through that. And that is why it is absolutely right that the government brought forward the changes in the law. It's absolutely right they brought them through in the way that they did. And it's absolutely right that this House overwhelmingly voted for them. And we heard a lot of legal references from the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green, but a very little mention of the fact that this House, this sovereign Parliament, has passed law that there should be LGBT inclusive education in this country. And that is what matters. It is the law. People, of course, are entirely free to believe and to understand their scriptures, their religions, in any way that they choose in their own private lives. I might fundamentally disagree with them. I've had many scriptural arguments with fellow Christians who don't agree with me on issues around human sexuality. But this country sets the law. This country sets the guidance. Our state sets the guidance. And we had many of these debates around the time I was there with my honourable friend around the equal marriage debate. And you will remember, Mr Speaker, some of the very impassioned debates that took place at that time. As a gay Christian, as somebody who believes fervently in my own religious understandings, my own faith, that is for me to argue with God, for me to argue with fellow Christians. But the law of this land should protect all, and it should protect all equal characteristics equally. Not just one over another at certain times and when certain people don't like it, or when a moral panic is whipped up by those from outside. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we can move on. I hope that we can see that there are many parts of this country with equally diverse religious communities, equally diverse understandings of life and the way we should all live together, but where we all live together in harmony and peace and respect for one another, and not where children are subjected to horrific protests outside of school, and where their teachers are subjected to that, and where we seem to be questioning some of the very basic principles that we have established in this House over so many years.
Hear, hear. Thank you. Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to be following my honourable friend. I rise really just to make one point and put it to the Minister. I welcome the fact, by the way, we're having this debate. I share my honourable friend's dismay about the scenes in Birmingham, but I think it's right that we should talk about it and discuss the concerns that have been raised. And my honourable friend from Birmingham Hall Green is right to remind us that religion or belief is among the protected characteristics identified in the Equality Act. But in the debate we had on the regulations on the 20th of March in the House, I raised concerns that were being voiced at that stage, particularly by representatives of the Orthodox Jewish community. And I asked whether, after the debate, if we held a meeting of the all-party parliamentary group on faith and society, which I chair, whether the Minister would ensure that officials from his department and from Ofsted came to the meeting in order to discuss with representatives of a wide range of faith groups the implementation of the regulations, and I'm very grateful to him that he did arrange for that, and the representatives came and the meeting took place. And there was one idea which emerged at that meeting which I wanted to put to him today. It's mentioned in a letter which I've copied to him, and that is that there should be a requirement that local plans for implementing the regulations in each area ought to be subject to consultation with the local Standing Advisory Committee on Religious Education, the SACRE, which exists in each area. And I recognise that in some areas there may well be a question about the capacity of those committees to undertake that consultation. In other areas they're certainly well up for doing it, and it is, I think in most areas, quite a wide and representative body, at the moment focused purely on religious education, but the suggestion that emerged was that its remit might be extended to take in local plans for implementing the relationships and sex education statutory instrument as well. And I wonder whether the Minister would be able today or separately just to respond to that specific idea which came out of the meeting, which he very helpfully supported after the debate in the House.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I say that I stand in this debate reflecting the fact that I represent a constituency where education is completely devolved, but I wished maybe to enter into a reflective mode for members. Growing up in the west of Scotland in a Catholic stroke Presbyterian Irish Catholic household, I am, like many other members, I've already heard similar backgrounds. Attending a state denominational school, both in primary and in secondary level, I went to a school in which being heterosexual was the only way you were allowed to be. Any other opportunity was not permitted. So the very idea that there is any question that people are going to be forced to be gay does not reflect on the reality of those who lived in a situation where we were told we could be nothing but straight. That is a historic reality. That's not to say that, living on the premise of history and reflecting on it, times do change. Unlike many of the honourable members on the main opposition benches, I represent a constituency which is profoundly undiverse. It is profoundly white. It is profoundly Christian, of half and half between the Roman Catholic faith and, of course, the National Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And we know, and I'm sure many members in this House will know, what religious intolerance can breed. It's called the Reformation, and it reminds us about the role of religion and the separation of religion and the law. But it does not mean that in Scotland, from 1918, we celebrated only last year 100 years of the Catholic Education Act. And I have to admit, Mr. Speaker, I only recently have returned to the faith of my ancestors. And I'm a person of dubious faith. And I think anyone who says that they are fundamental in their beliefs, no matter how they worship, who they worship, seriously needs to look in and give themselves a good talking to. Because without doubt, there can be no question that you cannot fully understand the diversity of humanity around you, and especially for parliamentarians who seek to understand the people they represent. So in terms of the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green, I would say to him, I hope they also reflect on the young gay men and women entering that school today, the ones who may vote for them or who may not vote for them, and how they understand this debate. There's also the role of parents. I grew up being brought up by a single parent. Did he make me gay? I don't think so. Did he make me like whiskey? I think he did. But he made me also question... well, I'll leave the Honourable Gentleman with that one. But he also made me question how you defend the rights of those who are minorities. He always did. And I also reflect on our own personal experience, and this is the only reason I wanted to stand today, was if, as a Scottish constituency MP, I could ask anything to this debate, hearing also from members from Wales who are concerned about the targeting of certain emails, and I have heard from my honourable friend and member for Glasgow Central that they have also now received emails about this debate and how it reflects in the Scottish education system, that in Scotland we have, of course, the Scottish Government's LGBTI Inclusive Education Working Group. And it should be noted that the Scottish Roman Catholic Bishops' Conference is clear that it could never again see a situation in which a pupil leaves a school in Scotland having prejudice-based bullying, and they fully signed up to the Scottish Government's Inclusive Education Working Group. If there's anything to be gained from this debate today, is to reflect on the lived experience of young gay men and women entering your schools. Now, their parents might not like the fact that they will grow up to be gay. That is a reality. You cannot detract from it, whether they live hiding in a closet or they live openly as young Christian gay people or young Muslim gay people, Hindu or Jew or secular. You cannot enable them to go back into the closet knowing that as elected representatives, we believe that they should not have a place in the education system. They're not enforcing gayness on folk. It is a ridiculous proposition. We live in a majority heterosexual normative world. That's the reality. All we're saying to those young men and women is we don't want them to be bullied, to be prejudiced, to self-harm, to take their lives, to go into lives filled with alcohol and drugs, to kill themselves. That's what we don't want. And if anything we should offer them today is a listening ear and not a judging one.
Thank you. Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was always taught as a child by my parents and at school, all the schools I went to, not to judge somebody according to the colour of their skin, and what school they went to, what accent they spoke with, whether they were a man or a woman, whether they were rich or poor, or for that matter whether they were straight or gay, but simply judge them according to the strength of their character, which would be evinced not by the words that they used, but the things that they did in their life. So I approach this debate just presuming that that's what all education should be, about teaching people to judge people according to the strength of their character and what they stand for and what they do with their lives, not some part of their personality which is almost certainly indelible and which wasn't acquired by, I don't know, watching Graham Norton or passing through the aftershave department or whatever prejudice people may have about how people come to be gay. I've never wanted a tolerant society. I hate the idea of being tolerated. It feels like people are saying, oh yes, all right, if you have to, if you really have to, you can live with somebody else and love them. I've always wanted a world that was based, and a society that was based on respect. And my honourable friend is absolutely right to say that when all of us in this chamber, I guess, were growing up, there were lots of people who are a lot younger than me, including you, Mr. Speaker. When we were growing up, it wasn't a world of respect for people's different sexualities. It was a world when people would shout faggot and queer, shirt raiser, bender, all these kind of things at you. And what was particularly difficult about that was that you brought it into yourself. You sort of believed it. And it took a terrible struggle for many people and to be able to tell another single human being. I mean, partly because you might be thinking that this other person might be gay as well, and you might think that they might have feelings for you, and then you suddenly find, oh my God, no, you've completely and utterly got it wrong, and then you end up being beaten up. Or it might be because you are actually terrified of what your parents might think. In fact, when I told my mother, she said she should always have known because I walk oddly. You'll all check now later, won't you, whether I walk oddly. She didn't mean it in a mean way at all. It was just the reactions that people had in a different era. And why I'm so proud, in a way, of being a member of the Labour Party, and this is not a criticism of people who are not members of the Labour Party, but there was a man, Edward Carpenter, who campaigned for homosexual freedom. I mean, in a generation when you got sent to prison for it and given 7 years with hard labour in prison for homosexuality. And on his 80th birthday, every member of the Labour cabinet in the 1920s sent him a birthday card. So I feel proud of being part of a Labour movement which has always, I think, wanted to do right by people who are gay. And there's a little story of a young man in the 1920s again, from the Rhondda. He was he worked on the railways. Thomas, I don't know his surname. But he was arrested in London, and he was taken to court for soliciting, or importuning was the word that was used at the time. This was, there didn't have to be any proof of anybody having touched anybody. The only proof that he might be homosexual and had committed offence was that he had a powder puff in his pocket. He said that it was his mother's, and the police didn't believe him, and he was carted off and charged and went to the magistrates' court. And again, what I'm proud of, the local MP for the Rhondda stood character witness for him. This is in the 1920s. So I have enormous pride in the fact that we've tried as a movement to build through the years that sense of respect, and eventually we were able to change the law in many different ways. We brought in civil partnerships. Many young people who were gay throughout the 20th century thought they'd never be able to live with another person, let alone be able to publicly acknowledge that they were entering into a union for life. And then the Conservative Party had the opportunity to bring in equal marriage as well. And that's a matter of enormous pride, I think, for this Parliament, for the whole of this Parliament. There are very few people now, really, in this Parliament who oppose any of those measures, or the adoption for gay couples and for individual gays. The fact that, most of us, if we go to a secondary school these days, there will be kids who are openly gay at school, and it's not a problem. Some of them will be camp, some of them will not be camp. It's not a problem. And that's just a source of immense joy. But I have an immense fear too. And this is why this debate really matters. And I want to say, in generosity, I hope, to my honourable friend, that why this debate hurts so many of us, is because we'd hoped we'd made a progress that would never be pushed back. And you've only got to look at Berlin in the 1930s, which was the most liberal place in the world for gay men, and then people were sent to the concentration camps and thousands of them died by the end of the 1930s and in the 1940s. So some of us fear that all of this could be rolled back. And we will fight, not physically, of course. We'll do it probably with drag queens and feather boas and all the stereotypes you can gather, and rugby players and football players one day, please God. We will fight to make sure that this is not rolled back. And part of that fight is, of course, with religion. I say this as somebody who was ordained as a priest. I remember, I hope the former Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harry, is now a member of the other place. He will forgive me if I just remind him of the fact that 2 weeks after he ordained me, which involves the laying on of hands, he was asked by a newspaper what he thought about homosexuality in the church, and he said, well, he'd never laid hands on a homosexual. And I just had to say to him, well, you did. The very first one you ordained, in actual fact. He's now a magnificent man and came to my civil partnership, and I have a deep affection for him because we've had this battle in the Church of England. It's an ongoing battle in the Catholic Church in the moment, and I think that there are many more open minds than there were 15, 20 years ago. I think, in fact, the Pope himself has a more liberal mind on these issues, and would be furious at the idea that Catholicism and the name of Christ could ever be invoked to lead to bullying or to somebody not valuing themselves because of their sexuality. And just as, incidentally, you can't catch homosexuality, so I don't think you can be cured of it. And I know we sort of smile and laugh about that, but actually there's a terrible pain that has been brought to so many people, individuals, by that whole gay conversion therapy theory. And I truly hope that is something that will never be a thing of the future. Now, I know this is a difficult issue for many who are Muslim. As it happens, my constituency is not diverse at all. It's more like the Honourable Member for East Dunbartonshire, West Dunbartonshire. I'm sure there's no segregation between the two. And in fact, my constituency, despite my having been ordained, is, according to the last census, the second least religious constituency in the country. But there are people of faith in my constituency. And I often say to them, and I think that they have found a profound generosity, actually, in recent years, in the main. But I think it is still a very difficult issue for many who are Muslim. And there are those who struggle to find new liberal ways of expressing Islam in a modern world. Many Catholic members of this House and of the other place, of course, have often have voted for equality, although their church has voted in a different way. And so my biggest hope is that Islam will find a way of reconciling the modern era, the things that we know, that I would argue our God has taught us to understand in the last 100, 200 years about ourselves and about humanity and about human sexuality, so that they will be campaigning outside all those schools to make sure that every child knows that actually sometimes there are two daddies, sometimes there are two mummies, and sometimes it may not be your parents, but it may be somebody else in your families or somebody else in the school. And no, you shouldn't spit at them, and you shouldn't denigrate them, and you shouldn't laugh at them, and you shouldn't call them names, and you shouldn't bully them. Because in the end, and I'll use a religious term again, equality is a seamless garment. It's Christ's tunic on the cross is a seamless garment. And that's why the soldiers can't tear it apart when he's taken down from the cross. And I think that of equality. The equality that we demand for people, regardless of their religion or their political allegiance or the colour of their skin or their gender, must also apply in equal measure, in full and equal measure, to our sexuality.
Richard Burden.
Mr. Speaker, a real privilege to follow so many moving and powerful speeches today. I haven't come in here intending to make a speech. I'd hoped to ask my honourable friend from Hall Green a couple of questions, but having heard what he said, I was moved to rise to make just a few points. The first is this. My honourable friend has sought to characterise what's been happening outside Anderton Park School as an issue of consultation. I have to say that from what I have seen, the message that comes across from those protests is not principally about consultation. Yes, it's in there, but it's actually about an objection in principle to LGBT inclusive education. If that's not the case, how else do you read a placard that says it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve? What's that if it's not objecting in principle to LGBT inclusive education. But, you know, it's not just about the fact that those views are being expressed. It's the aggression with which they've been expressed that has upset and profoundly offended so many people, I believe, of all races and of all religions in Birmingham. The level of abuse that the head teacher has suffered, the kind of thing that has been said through megaphones, not just at Anderton Park, but before that at Parkfield School as well, is utterly outrageous. And I think we have got a responsibility in this place to stand up and say that is simply not on. Now, my honourable friend has said that if he has upset or offended anyone, he apologises for that. I mean, I'm grateful he said that, and I welcome that. But I do hope he will reflect that when on camera he turns to one of the leaders of those protests, a man who does not even have a child at that school, and says, "You're right, no more, no less, you're right." I do hope he will reflect on whether those words were wisely chosen, because I do not believe that the message that that gentleman has given is right. Now, dialogue between parents and schools is obviously a good thing. In any part of the curriculum, it's obviously a good thing. But there's also some principles at stake here, and some principles that deserve repeating. You see, sometimes the way this is talked about is that if it's about sex education, it's not. It's nothing about sexualisation at all. It's about relationships education. And to me, there is one word, and it's come up several times in this debate so far, that is absolutely central to all relationships education, and that is the importance of respect. Yes. And, you know, I'm sorry, I disagree with my honourable friend. I don't think there's any age-appropriate threshold for respect. You know, I believe that from the word go, children should be taught to respect other people, whoever they are, whatever they are. And I don't believe we would be right in adopting a curriculum or adopting an approach which somehow implies to young people that if they go to school with a friend who's got two daddies or two mummies instead of one daddy and one mummy, that somehow he or she or his or her parents are less deserving of any respect than the other child's parents. I just think that is a principle which should be taught from the word go, and it's something we should have no problem in upholding. It's something that I believe is a principle. It's something on which I will not compromise, and it's the reason I'm afraid on this issue I am on the other side of the fence from my honourable friend.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I grew up in a relatively white, middle class, you could say, suburb of Brighton, a town called Lewes. People of Lewes will hate it that I've called it a suburb of Brighton, but effectively it is. And I could have lived my life as a child, never really interacting with people of different faiths, never really interacting and learning about different kind of family units. I grew up in a family of a mum and a dad who were married before I was born and remain married now. But the reason that I understand that there are different family units, that there are people of different religions, is from the very get-go at school, we read books and we were told stories about different families. And when the school was going to introduce a book about a child who was maybe Muslim, they didn't call an all-parents meeting to consult and ask, we're going to be introducing a book of which will introduce a character this semester, this term, that might not quite look like the kind of characters that you see every day in Lewes. No, the school got on with it. And parents accepted it because there was leadership shown, of course, not just by schools, but by many people in the community, that that was the right thing to do. So when we're introducing rather mundane books, many of these stories and educational methods are pretty mundane. You know, about a mermaid or about two penguins or whatever the particular story is. They're not actually that exciting. To be honest, when we're introducing them, do I expect a head teacher to have to call an all-parent assembly to consult on that particular fiction book that's going to be introduced, that is at the right reading level and, of course, is generally appropriate for those children? No, I don't. And actually, I think it's rather dangerous if we kind of expect that to be the basis of how teachers have to teach. Every time they want to introduce something new, they're going to teach about biology, or they're going to teach arithmetic this month rather than just equations, that they call an all-school assembly. No, I think that would be ridiculous. And I think that is the approach that we need to be treating this kind of issue. It is about talking about all different kinds of ways the world works, through storytelling, through narrative telling, and not telling the individuals of what goes in and what goes out, but actually about what love means. And actually that is also important for keeping our children safe. Because if children are not taught about what appropriate relationships are, if they're not taught about what friendships mean, compared to what loving relationships mean, what a relationship between adults means, differently to relationships between children. If you're not taught some of those basic facts, what you actually do is allow our children to be vulnerable to predators, either at that young age or later on in life. And that I will give way.
Making a really excellent speech and making a really excellent point, and my daughter's just come back from school because the Scottish schools finish up pretty soon with a whole bundle of things that she has learnt in primary one, and a lot of that is about those kind of relationships and pretty basic stuff. But would you agree with me that if children aren't all in the same class taught all the same things, they're going to find it out from the other children in the class anyway? So you might as well all get the same information and get a good responsible education from their teachers.
Quite, and the danger is, of course, if they learn it second-hand. We all know how Chinese whispers that game works, don't we? By the time it's the third child down, the message will have been garbled and lost. So if we're going to teach our children about these ideas of respect, about how to keep them safe, we need to do that in the whole way. Now, I was taught by my parents, of course, that, you know, it didn't matter who you fell in love with. I can remember as a child being sung nursery rhymes about falling in love with different groups of people. That's the kind of family that I grew up in. And I feel very proud to have had parents that have introduced these concepts. And, you know, my sister is a happily married, heterosexual woman. She had these songs taught to her and sung to her when she was young as well. It didn't make me necessarily gay, but it made me comfortable with who I was. But my fear is, and the reality is, let's be honest, parents are loving, but there's no qualification to be a parent. You have some good parents and you have some bad parents. If I had been let to be taught science by my mother, who dropped out of science at GCSE, is a linguist and is an English teacher, but knows absolutely nothing about physics or maths, I would have not been able to go on to do my physics A-level or my chemistry A-levels that I did when I was at school. We understand that parents, of course, are the primary lovers of their children, but they aren't always the best to give a holistic, rounded education, because they also have not experienced all different elements and all different aspects of the world. People in responsibility, whether it is teachers or whether it is members of Parliament, have a responsibility in these kinds of debates to show leadership. And it was actually the Labour government in 1997 to 2010 that showed leadership. If we had just followed the mob, followed what the opinion polls were saying at the time, it is very likely we wouldn't have made much progress at all on a lot of LGBT rights. We wouldn't have made progress on abolishing Section 28 because Brian Souter was busy ploughing money in to garner, of course, public opinion in one way. Because we as politicians have to recognise public opinion can be whipped up by dangerous forces. And we have a moral responsibility to sometimes make a judgment, not on whether there has been consultation one way or another. This was a totally vacuous argument that had no content to it. But what is the content of the objections? Analyse it and review it, something I'm afraid the honourable member failed to do or articulate in this debate once. Not once did he articulate, actually, the problems with the content of the curriculum.
And in friend give way?
I will do, yeah.
My old friend, like many members in this debate, is making a very powerful and moving speech. Does he share my concern that actually lots of parents are perfectly satisfied with what is being taught in schools, are perfectly happy that it teaches about respect and about different families, but that if we have the protests of the sort that we've seen, then those parents don't feel able to express that view because they feel intimidated and aren't able to stand up for the things that they'd like their children to be taught about and that children themselves want to be taught about as well.
I totally agree, and that is, of course, even more important that a member of this House, and I would not want to tell anyone how to do their job, but doesn't then go and plonk on one side of that debate without actually analysing, until my honourable friend gave the resources to the honourable member, analysing the content of what was being discussed. It is extremely dangerous to not show that leadership, and I think that is where this debate was wrong from the very beginning. And actually, I think the honourable member has been wrong, deeply wrong, on how he has handled this issue. Pandering to the mob is never right, but it is always easy for an MP to do, and we go in the wrong direction if we do it. Let us remember, of course, one of the instigators of Section 28 was that book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin, I think it was. Again, a pretty mundane, pretty boring book if you read it, you know. Jenny goes and has an ice cream, Jenny goes and gets a book read by one of her fathers. I mean, it's hardly high literature. But a backlash to that, in a backdrop of rising right-wing tensions in a country... Pardon? I thought you said something, Mr. Speaker. Of course, caused Section 28 to be introduced. Now, I don't think we are on the verge of Section 28 to being introduced now. But if one is not vigilant in bringing people along on that journey... Now, I'll finish on 2 points. One is I think there is a place to bring parents along on this journey, not to consult on whether something should be included in the curriculum or not, but to some extent to make up for the fact that we did have Section 28 for so long, and many parents failed to receive this level of education and understanding. So I think there is a purpose of reaching out into the community. And before I became an MP, I wrote an education resource for the Council of Europe, which was how you talk to educators and children under the age of 10 about sexuality, different families. Now, the Council of Europe is hardly has members of purely progressive countries, you know, Russia, Turkey, Poland. This is a resource that is accessible in all of those countries now, and I'm very proud of that resource that a team of us helped write. But that was because people in the Council of Europe, British ministers actually as well, helped lead a debate in those levels to change attitudes and to be able to run campaigns to also change minds and to educate people. So I do wish that actually we hadn't have really received an apology, because what we heard was a defence of the position that the honourable member made, and then some little apology at the end. I wish he'd just been honest about actually having real problems about either the content of this or that he hadn't really decided to take a side one way or another. What we now have is a very disappointing outcome. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I call the Minister of State at the Department of Education, Mr. Nicholas Gibb, to reply to the debate.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. This has been an extraordinary adjournment debate. Mr. Speaker, worth waiting 10 years in the chair to listen to, I would argue, with very powerful speeches by the honourable members for Birmingham, Erdington, Cardiff South and Penarth, West Dunbartonshire and the Rhondda, and a powerful and moving speech by the honourable member for Wallasey, who was right to say that we are not going to allow another generation of children to go through what previous generations endured. And as the honourable member for the Rhondda said, what is wanted is not to be tolerated, but to be respected. or as the Honourable Member for Wallasey said, plain, simple decency. And there were well-argued and persuasive speeches by the Honourable Members for Birmingham, Northfield, East Ham and Brighton, Kent Town. Now, I listened carefully to the speech of the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green on opening this debate. This government agrees that parents, as the primary educators of their children, should be involved in their child's education in schools. The government trusts schools to deliver a broad and balanced curriculum that will prepare pupils for life in modern Britain. And we firmly believe that proper dialogue between schools and parents supports mutual understanding and ultimately benefits the progress of pupils. Schools should, in particular, consider whether aspects of their curriculum may be sensitive to the parents of their particular cohort, and if so, should ensure that they have properly engaged them on this content. But we must also remember that schools have been given the responsibility to educate, and ultimately it is for schools to decide what is taught and how. Equality for all is written into our laws. The Equality Act 2010 provides a legal framework to protect the rights of individuals and advance equality of opportunity for all. It provides Britain with a discrimination law which protects individuals from unfair treatment and promotes a fair and more equal society. Schools are required to comply with the relevant requirements of the Equality Act. Chapter 1 of Part 6 of the Act applies to schools. As an example, Part 6 of the Act makes it unlawful for a school to discriminate against, harass or victimise a pupil or potential pupil in relation to admissions, or in how the school is run. The content of the school curriculum is exempt from the duties imposed on schools by Part 6 of the Equality Act. Excluding the content of the curriculum ensures, as the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green pointed out, it ensures that schools are free to include a full range of issues, ideas and materials in their syllabus, and to expose pupils to thoughts and ideas of all kinds, however challenging or controversial, without fear of legal challenge based on a protected characteristic. Schools are, however, subject to the public sector equality duty in section 149 of the Act, which means that in discharging their functions they must have due regard to the need to eliminate discrimination, harassment, victimisation and any other conduct that is prohibited by or under the Act, and have due regard to the need to advance equality of opportunity and foster good relations between persons who share a relevant protected characteristics and persons who do not share it. Relevant protected characteristics are age, disability, gender reassignment, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. We know that many schools choose to teach pupils about the Equality Act and the protected characteristics in the context of duties on schools, such as the requirements to promote both fundamental British values and the spiritual, moral, social and cultural development of their pupils. Schools are perfectly entitled to teach about the Equality Act in this context, and the department thinks it is right that pupils leave school with a proper understanding of the importance of equality and respecting difference. And to answer the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green's question on age appropriateness, schools who choose to teach about the Equality Act and protected characteristics should, of course, consider the age appropriateness of all elements of this and plan their curriculum accordingly. That crucial need, Mr. Speaker, to respect difference would, of course, be a simple expectation of members of our society were all differences easily compatible. The true test of the concept of respect for difference lies in cases where our differences may appear to bring us in direct conflict with others. The fundamental expectation is that we respect other people, and therefore at times this is hard to achieve and all the more crucial for it. Now, this has been seen in action in recent months as some differences have seemed to divide us. We have seen protests from parents related to the teaching of equality in our schools, with a particular focus on teaching lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender content. Now, the media would like to portray this as religion versus LGBT. I don't doubt that there are some people on either side of this debate, without links to the schools involved, who are exploiting the situation due to their own lack of tolerance to the other. But I truly believe that for the majority, there is a real respect for their fellow citizens who are different from them. What is central to this debate are deeply held views on what is right to teach children about LGBT people and relationships at different ages. Not because of... I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
The Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Is he as worried as I am about the evidence which is emerging of an organised campaign to disrupt the introduction of RSE in schools, which is now spreading from Birmingham to other places? And will he reassure us that his department will crack down with the utmost determination on those attempts?
Well, as a government, we are a government that introduced the regulations making RSE compulsory in schools. It was the 2014. It was the amendment to the 2017 Act that introduced that requirement, supported by members on both sides of the House. Today, we are publishing the final version of the guidance that was put out for consultation. So we are absolutely determined to press ahead with this policy. And I think it is a policy that has been very carefully crafted with help from across the House, from individual members of Parliament who have helped us in devising and writing the policy, with Ian Balcombe, an experienced head teacher from Kent, who helped us draft the guidance, and of course officials from the Department of Education who worked extremely hard in crafting that regulation, those guidance, and we will of course press ahead with that policy. I'm stuck for choice, so I think I will start with the Right Honourable Gentleman.
The Minister for giving way, and I apologise for not being here for the earlier part of the debate, but I'm pleased that I was able to arrive in time to hear for the members for Wallasey, Cardiff South and Rhondda. It encouraged me to stay to the end of the debate. But could I ask the Minister specifically as a follow-up question to the point made by the member for Wallasey, what precisely is the government able to do in terms of countering what appears to be an organised campaign? For instance, could he provide materials to members of Parliament like me who are now getting representations from, in my case, one of the local mosques on this issue?
Certainly providing materials together with the guidance that we published today to schools in how to consult and engage with parents on this issue. The Secretary of State made it very clear in Education Questions on Monday what his view is about the importance of teaching about LGBT issues in schools, including in primary schools, and I've written articles and so on. And we will continue to make the case for the importance of RSE. I'm moving slowly leftwards, but the Honourable Member for Rhondda.
Well, we're all excited by the Minister moving slightly leftwards. I'm grateful to him. Isn't it also worth pointing out that there's an irony here? Many parents who are particularly concerned about their children growing up might want to know that good sex and relationship education nearly always leads to children taking delaying their first sexual experience, to making fewer risky decisions when they do so, and for making more informed choices, which can only surely be in the interest of every single child.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to make those points. He makes them better than I could have, and he will have seen the guidance that was out for drafting, which is now in final form, and it sets out the important aspects of all those issues that he has cited and what we believe should be taught in our schools. Give way to the Honourable Member for...
I do want to press the Minister a little bit further on the points raised by honourable friends about the sort of organisation of the campaign against the introduction of the guidance. I mean as I mentioned in my speech, I've seen an actual guide provided to parents from an organisation called Islamic RSE, which actually advises them to kind of get into governors' bodies, how to handle head teachers, how to do this and that in quite a kind of a cynical way, and then a form letter which is deeply, deeply misleading, attacking the entire government's policy. Does he have any plans to issue guidance to schools about this sort of orchestrated campaign, and indeed to work with the Welsh and Scottish governments, who indeed are going to undoubtedly experience this as well? I have raised it with officials in my own city.
Well, I'm very happy to work with the Honourable Gentleman, and of course we do work with the devolved administrations on this and other issues relating to education. The guidance was very carefully crafted and written in order to build the widest possible consensus for this policy, which is why it went through this House and this House with an overwhelming majority, and the other House without a division. And I would say that those people who are opposed to it are at the other end of that consensus. And I'm afraid it's unlikely that we will bring those extreme ends of the debate into that consensus. But I'm very content that we have secured the support of the Catholic Church, the Church of England, and organisations such as Stonewall in support of the guidance that we have created. I give way to the Honourable Member for Brighton Kent.
I thank the member for describing these people who have objections at the real fringes. The difficulty is if there is a requirement on head teachers to consult, and that opens the door for these fringe elements to then hijack and to disrupt, how should head teachers respond? Will the Department for Education issue guidance to prevent that happening? And will he ensure that even when consultation happens, it is not consultation with a veto by those fringe groups, but consultation to bring people along. But it is happening. It's not a question of if and when and how. It's just so everyone can understand how. That is what we mean by consultation in this case, because I think it's a bit unclear.
Well, I will come to these points later on in my comments, but consultation is not a vote. And ultimately, the decision about the content of the curriculum is for the schools. And we are issuing, as I've said, materials with the final version of the guidance today to schools to help them in the process of engaging with parents. But I listened to the comments about campaigning and standing up to the campaigns against RSE, and we will consider what honourable members in this debate have said. I'll give way to the honourable member.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I wonder if he will be taking any guidance from Nazir Afzal, who is the former Crown prosecutor in the North West. And I understand that he has been brought in to mediate over this whole situation about the protests outside the schools. He is himself a practising Muslim. He's a very sensible man. He's the chair of the governors at Hotwood Hall College in my constituency. And I wonder if you will be taking any advice from him.
Well, I will take the Honourable Lady's advice under advisement. But what I would say is that our senior officials are working on the ground on a daily basis for both schools involved in this dispute in Birmingham and with Birmingham City Council in trying to find a solution to this problem. So we are working very hard to try to assuage concerns, if you like, but ultimately we will be on the side of the head teacher in making these decisions, because we do believe that ultimately the content of the curriculum is a matter for schools. Now, what is central, Mr. Speaker, to this debate are deeply held views on what it's right to teach children about LGBT people and relationships at different ages, not because of bigotry or intolerance, not to push an agenda, but because they believe they know best for the children involved. This reveals the truth about equality and respect. Sometimes it is hard. And when opinions differ, we should talk. Dialogue is what moves us forward. Now, that is why, Mr. Speaker, we are strengthening requirements on schools to consult parents. From September 2020, all primary schools will be required to teach relationships education, and all secondary schools will be required to teach relationships and sex education, or RSE. We've set out in the regulations for these subjects that schools will be required to consult parents on their relationships or RSE policies. This requirement means that the dialogue we consider so important in reducing misunderstanding and getting this teaching right will be happening in every school. And it is important to note that relationships education is not about sex, as was pointed out by the Honourable Member for the Rhondda. It is about learning the importance of kindness and respect for others, and providing children with the foundations to understand difference and be able to build constructive relationships with those who may appear different from them. We are encouraging as many schools as possible to start teaching the new subjects from September 2019, and whether or not schools do so, we recommend they start planning their consultation with parents now to ensure this is done in good time and that it's done effectively. And we'll be publishing, as I've said, we are publishing supporting materials to help schools to get this right. Now, schools are not required to consult parents on any teaching they choose to give about the Equality Act. When this involves young children, however, and when schools know that their pupils' parents have strongly held beliefs related to the content, it is absolutely right that they engage with parents, listen to their views and reflect. And to answer the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hall Green's question, I think it would be appropriate for a school to work with parents to determine how and when teaching of the Equality Act is delivered in the school, if that works for them. This does not mean that head teachers should spend excessive time consulting parents, or that consultation should go on in perpetuity. Schools are well practiced at consulting and engaging their parent body on aspects of their activities. Where they have good practices in place, they can and should be used to consult parents on this topic. If schools feel that their current engagement processes are not effective, the introduction of the new subjects is a good opportunity to learn from good practice in other schools and to improve. Consultation does not mean parents can veto curriculum content. It means sharing a proposed approach, seeking views, and using these to inform a final decision. It is not a vote. Consultation does not mean abandoning teaching about respect for difference. I don't believe this is what parents would want, and it's not what schools should feel they must do. Consultation certainly does not mean schools should be on the receiving end of intimidating behaviour, protests or bullying. The department has been very clear that protests outside primary schools are unacceptable and should stop. The RSE legislation is clear that it is parents that schools must consult. We do, of course, encourage schools to recognise and reflect on their important foundational role in local communities, and where schools consider it useful to engage members of their wider community on any of their activities, including teaching of relationships in sex education, we would support that activity. But consultation does mean considering whether the strongly held views of their parent body should lead the school to adapt when and how they approach certain topics with their pupils. It is only right for parents to be able to share their views on what and when their child will be taught topics that are sensitive to them. And schools should consider those views. I just finished this one point, if the Honourable Member for East Ham will forgive me. It is only right for parents to be able to share their views on what and when their child will be taught topics that are sensitive to them, and schools should consider those views and balance them with their views on the needs of the pupils and wider school community. Ultimately, it is for schools to decide their curriculum, having taken on these views. I give way to the Honourable Member.
Minister, for giving way. I just wonder whether he agreed with the point I made, that it could be helpful in quite a number of local areas, I think, to include the local SACRE in the discussions that he's describing.
Grateful to the Honourable Member for East Ham for raising this issue. Now I was going to respond to his question. We will consider his suggestion. That's not a promise, but we will certainly consider and take seriously what he has put forward. Now, as the Secretary of State set out in his recent letter to the General Secretary of the National Association of Head Teachers, schools must have the flexibility to respond to events. For example, a school, following consultation with parents on equality teaching or relationships education, may decide that for their pupils it is right to introduce teaching about LGBT people and relationships in the later years of primary school, and this will be an entirely reasonable decision. Subsequently, however, I'll give way to just one moment, I just want to finish this point. Subsequently, however, events may mean that this decision has to change. For example, if homophobic, biphobic or transphobic bullying becomes a problem in the school, the head teacher may reasonably decide that some teaching about LGBT at an earlier stage is required to ensure pupils understand that this bullying is not acceptable. Alternatively, a pupil with same-sex parents may join the school in an earlier year group, and in these circumstances it would be right for the pupil's peers to understand about families with same-sex parents to ensure that the pupil feels included. I'll give way to all honourable members in just one moment. It would be right for the pupil's peers to understand about families with same-sex parents to ensure that the pupil feels included and their peers understand and respect their family. I believe we can all agree that in those circumstances the school would be right to change their approach and to teach the issue early. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Minister, for giving way, and I anticipate that many of my honourable colleagues have anticipated what I was going to ask, which is, how will you know whether there are children in that school who have an uncle or an aunt or a friend who's got same-sex parents? Surely it's appropriate that every child from the earliest age should know that there are all sorts of different families, some with one parent, some with two parents, some with two parents who are two mums or two dads, because the school isn't going to know what everybody's experiences are, and everyone should know that it's right to respect difference, irrespective of where we come across it.
Well, as I said, we consulted very widely on the content of the draft guidance, and we brought in experts to help us draft it, such as Ian Bowcombe, a very experienced head teacher. We wanted to form the widest possible consensus on landing this policy, and that is what I believe we have achieved very successfully, something that I believe other governments have not achieved in the past. I think it is very important that we try and get that consensus, and that does mean leaving to schools the decision about when these issues should be taught. What is clear from the guidance is that at some point in a child... I will give way to all honourable members in a moment, starting with the member for Birmingham Hall Green. It is important that schools decide when it is appropriate in their community to teach these very sensitive issues, but it is a requirement that at some point during their school career, those children will learn and will be taught about LGBT issues. This, I believe, is the way to ensure that this policy has the widest possible consensus, albeit we cannot bring into that consensus those at the polar ends of this debate. I give way to the member for Birmingham Hall Green.
Could I thank the Minister for his very measured and very clear response to the questions I put to him. I think what he has said today, although it may not be acceptable to other members in this House, will be hugely beneficial and helpful to the teachers in Birmingham who are now reassured in 256 schools that what they've been doing is in fact correct. And I thank him for that.
I'm grateful for the honourable member's intervention, but I also believe what's being taught in the remaining two schools is also lawful and correct. I'll start on the right again. I'll give way to the honourable member for Western Buckingham.
Quite a clarification, Mr. Speaker. I say I'm delighted and thank God for devolution. But in clarification for some of my colleagues from English constituencies and for my own mind, can you therefore say that those single parents who happen to be homosexual will now need to self-identify to members of staff from schools across the length and breadth of England to make sure that their children get access to equal inclusive education?
No, what I'm saying is that you need to leave these decisions, these very sensitive decisions, to the teachers on the ground, to the head teachers of the school itself, because they are best placed to make decisions that cannot be made at a national level and that will apply to all schools in all communities. What we are clear about is that children must be taught about LGBT relationships. They must be taught the relationships curriculum. No other government has delivered such a policy. It is the right policy. But I believe very strongly that it needs to have the consensus of the religious organisations as well as Stonewall to enable this policy to land effectively in our schools. And I believe that it is landing successfully in our schools. I'll give way to Honourable Member for the Rhondda.
Well, I mean, I agree with him to this extent, that it should, of course, be up to the school and to the teachers to make that decision about what is age appropriate. However, he seemed to be suggesting that it was only once homophobic bullying had arisen in a school, that a school would start talking about respect for gay people. He seemed to be saying that it was only once a gay couple who were parents of a child appeared in the school that should be taught about. I'm sure that's not what he really means, so I just hope he can clarify.
What I was trying to do in my comments was to give an example where, after consultation, that a school may well want to change their policy because of events that had happened in the school. Now, it might be that the school had ab initio decided to teach about LGBT issues at an earlier stage in a primary school curriculum, and schools are perfectly entitled to do that, and then they should consult with parents on that, and then that will then be the policy of the school going forward, regardless of whether any of those issues arose, and regardless of whether they knew or didn't know about the parental background of pupils in their school. I'll give way to Honourable Member for Cardiff.
The Minister for giving way, and he's been extremely generous in responding, but I do have to say I share the concerns. I mean, if he's being praised by the honourable gentleman for Birmingham Hall Green about this, I do worry about where things have headed. And the problem is, if we create loopholes or opportunities for very, very radical activists, as we've seen in this case, to try and undermine head teachers, to try and intimidate, to try and undermine the overall government guidance, then they will take those opportunities. And I want to be assured that he's going to be providing full backing and ensuring that all children, regardless of what their age is, are getting this. Not, for example, it being done on the last day of Year 6 or some other way of circumventing the law, because I'm sure that's what some circumstances they will try and do.
Well, the law is very clear. These issues have to be taught, and we will be supporting schools very strongly in delivering this curriculum. What we are saying is that they need to consult parents, but then, having consulted parents, they don't have to. It's not like, as I said, it's not an elected decision about. It's not like a vote of an act of Parliament through this House. Once they've made that gone through that consultation, taken on board the views that have been expressed during the consultation, it is then for the school to decide, in their best judgment, what they think is the right material to be taught and when, and we will stand by the schools that take that decision. I give way to Honourable Member for Wallasey.
The honourable gentleman for giving way, because until we got to that passage in his speech, I thought I understood what the situation was. But what he seems to be saying is that he's going to give very radicalised, fundamentalist-type campaigns options to make as much fuss as possible in order to prevent the teaching of LGBT equality and relations until it's easier to do it. And what he said in his speech a few minutes ago, I fear, and I hope that he'll be able to put me right on this, is an almost open invitation to these organisations that are already spreading disruption across the country to do even more of it. You cannot compromise with organisations like this, and if the Minister doesn't stand up to them now, he will regret it.
Yeah. Well, I think the Right Honourable Lady is being unjust in how she's interpreting what I've said in my speech. I made it very clear that schools should consult parents. I made it very clear that they are not bound by a vote of those parents, that ultimately the decision on the content of the curriculum and how it's taught and when it's taught is a matter for the school, and we will support the school in that decision once it's been reached. And we've also made it very clear that we do not support protests outside schools, and, to use her phrase, to require young children to have to run the gauntlet of screaming and shouting protesters. We absolutely do not support those protests, and we support Birmingham City Council. We supported them in taking that injunction against those protests. So I think she's being slightly unfair in the way she's heard my speech. I give way to the Honourable Member for Brighton and Kempton.
I'm slightly concerned that we are getting caught up in the wrong way about this age appropriateness. And the Minister referred to the times that this education would be introduced full stop. You could bring it forward or you could delay it. My understanding is that this information, this education around being safe, around safeguarding of children, around what appropriate relationships are, should start from the very beginning of school all the way through. The age appropriateness is what age appropriate at each level and how you address it at each level, not about whether it is introduced at each level. And I think that we need to be clear, because there was a danger that he sounded to be siding like some of the few fanatical bigots that the honourable member sided with, rather than actually progressive morals that we want to side with in this country.
Well, relationship education is required to be taught from the very beginning of primary school, but of course it does have to be age appropriate. So it is about friends and sharing and learning about the importance of family. No, there's no intention of delaying the introduction of relationship education. What is a matter for the school is when more sensitive issues are taught, and that really is a matter for the school to decide ultimately. And in doing so, they should be consulting parents, but that doesn't mean to say that parents have a veto on the decisions taken by the school. Now, the Secretary of State and I are clear. I'll give way for the final time. They really want to.
Could you just clarify for me, what is sensitive? I mean, in terms of this context, what do we mean by sensitive? Do we mean talking about families that are single parents, etc.? Or are we talking about trans issues? Or what is sensitive? Because I'm a bit confused and I'm a bit worried that that word will be used as a hook to put things that we might not want to put on.
Well, that again is a matter of judgment for the school. They will know their communities, and that's why we are saying, and it's a requirement, that on these issues that the school should be consulting parents. In fact, all the best schools in the country consult their parents on a wide range of issues, and they may even consult them on issues such as arithmetic. It's very important to have parental engagement with a school. And I think, and I know schools that do talk to parents about how reading is taught in their schools. If they're introducing a new phonics scheme, they will want to talk to parents about those kind of issues. So I think parental engagement is important on this particular curriculum. Now, the Secretary of State and I are clear that we support any school, having engaged with parents and listened to their views, that takes a reasonable decision to teach their pupils about LGBT people and relationships. And the guidance on relationships education and RSE makes clear that pupils should receive LGBT inclusive relationships and sex education during their school years. And the department strongly encourages primary schools to teach about families with same-sex parents. Now, in most cases, this will be possible, and an important part of the education about respect for difference that's right for all pupils. And I hope that in all cases, parents will have discussed these topics with their child's school and understood their approach. And I hope that they will have satisfied themselves that the school is teaching the right things at the right age to complement what they teach their child on the importance of respecting other people. Now, I'm grateful to the honourable member for Birmingham Hall Green for his views on this important topic today. Parents are the primary educators of their children, and on matters such as equality, respect and relationships, schools complement what the child is taught at home. It is therefore crucial that schools and parents engage in constructive dialogue to understand each other's views. Only through open communication can trust be built and maintained, and proper respect shown for difference.
Order. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As when is of that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.